In June 1944, the beaches of Normandy burn with smoke and thunder, but miles inland, another war is being fought, not with bullets, but with brushes, wires, and imagination. The young man's name was Elliot Marks, a 23-year-old art student from New York City. He used to paint city skylines and portraits in Central Park for a few dollars a day. Now he stood in a muddy French field surrounded by inflatable tanks. It looked absurd, rubber Shermans glistening under the grey sky, some leaning slightly as if tired. A few soldiers walked among them, adjusting ropes, patching leaks, painting fake mud streaks to make them battle-worn. It was all a lie, but a necessary one. Elliot was part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known only to a handful of generals. Their mission: deceive the German army into believing an entire armored division was here, where in truth there were barely 100 men. They called it the Ghost Army. That morning, a sergeant barked, "Get those dummies in line. If the Krauts are watching from the air, they better believe we've got a whole damn corps here." Elliot tightened the ropes on a half-deflated tank, grunting as the wind whipped his jacket. Beside him, another soldier, a Broadway stage designer before the war, was painting serial numbers onto the rubber hull. "Think they'll buy it?" Elliot asked. The man grinned. "Kid, I've fooled audiences for 10 years with cardboard castles and painted clouds. Germans won't know the difference." The deception was more than visual. Hidden behind a line of trees, sound engineers were setting up giant loudspeakers, each the size of a small car. From them would blast the thunder of tank engines, the clank of treads, the rumble of convoys moving through mud. They'd recorded real sounds back in England and could loop them for hours, shifting direction as if a massive force were on the move. Nearby, radio operators began transmitting fake messages, chatter about troop movements, supply drops and artillery positions. The frequencies were the same ones the Germans monitored daily. Every message, every sound, every tank shadow was part of a carefully crafted illusion. This wasn't war as Elliot had imagined it. It was theatre. Dangerous, high-stakes theatre. Night fell quickly. The men gathered in a small tent, eating cold rations by lantern light. Some sketched by candle glow. Faces, tanks, even the silhouettes of enemy planes. Elliot found it strange that among these soldiers were some of the most creative minds he had ever met. Painters, sculptors, fashion designers, architects. "Do you ever think," one of them said, "that someday people won't believe this was real?" Elliot smiled faintly. "They'll believe the tanks, not the men who made them." Outside, the wind howled across the empty field. From a distance, the inflatable army looked real, deadly, imposing, alive, and in a way it was. It carried the hopes of real soldiers fighting miles away. 2 days later, the plan went into motion. Their false division, the U.S. 6th Armored, was to distract the German 2nd Panzer Division from reinforcing the Allied front near St. Lo. If the Germans took the bait, thousands of real Allied troops would survive. If they didn't, the Ghost Army would be exposed and wiped out. At dawn, the fake tanks shimmered with morning dew. From above, they looked convincing. German reconnaissance planes circled overhead. The men froze under camouflage nets, listening to the distant buzz fade. By noon, the speakers thundered to life. The air shook with the sound of engines and grinding treads. Dust plumes were kicked up deliberately by jeeps towing barrels behind them, simulating tank movement. Radio chatter filled the air. "Charlie Company, move to Sector 9. Repeat, all units advancing east." The Germans were listening. Elliot manned an observation post near a hedgerow, binoculars in hand. Through the glass, he saw faint flashes on the horizon. Enemy artillery repositioning. They were buying it. That night, rain poured. Mud sucked at their boots and the sound equipment shorted twice. Elliot worked under a poncho trying to keep the inflatable tanks from collapsing under the downpour. A buddy yelled over the storm, "You ever think this is crazy?" Elliot shouted back, "All the time." He laughed, but his heart pounded. They were playing a dangerous game, pretending to be an army while the real one fought for its life. Then came the news. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed that the German Panzer Division had halted its movement, convinced the Americans were massing armor to strike from this sector. Their trick had worked. The real offensive, miles to the west, advanced with minimal resistance. Thousands of lives were saved, all because of a show staged in the mud by men with paintbrushes and air pumps. 3 days later, they packed up. The rubber tanks were deflated, rolled, and loaded into trucks. Speakers were covered, radios silenced. They left no trace, just muddy tracks and scraps of canvas fluttering in the wind. As they drove away, Elliot looked back at the empty field. For a moment he felt a strange sadness. Their battlefield would never be remembered. No medals, no headlines, no parades, just silence. But he knew the truth. In that silence, thousands of soldiers were still alive. Months later, after Paris was liberated, the Ghost Army moved again, staging new illusions across Europe from the Rhine to the Ardennes. Everywhere they went, they fought with deception and saved with imagination. When the war finally ended, Elliot returned home to New York. He went back to painting, but his canvases changed. No more skylines or portraits. He painted fields of light and shadow where things weren't always what they seemed. Sometimes, when people asked about his service, he'd smile and say, "I painted tanks once." They'd laugh, thinking it was a joke. He never explained further. Because how do you explain a war where the most powerful weapon was illusion? In 1996, the US Army finally declassified the Ghost Army's mission. Their operations saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, artists, soundmen, and dreamers had fought and won a war of shadows. September 17th, 1944. Over the Dutch countryside, the sky was filled with parachutes. For a few brief moments, it looked like it was raining men. The air was cold and thin as Private Thomas Wilkes clutched the static line in the belly of the Dakota aircraft. He was 21, a milkman from Liverpool before the war, and now, somehow, a paratrooper in the 1st British Airborne Division. Below, the neat fields of Holland rolled past like a map. He could see the silver line of a river glinting in the sun. The Rhine. Their target. The bridge at Arnhem. "Stand up!" the jump master yelled. Thomas's boots thudded against the metal floor. His heart hammered so loud he could barely hear the engines. He'd trained for this moment for months, but now that it had come, it felt unreal, like stepping into a story he didn't belong in. The green light blinked. He jumped. For a few seconds there was only wind, the roar, the sudden silence, and then the tug of the parachute opening above him. All around, white canopies bloomed like flowers across the sky. Below, tracer fire stitched through the air, red lines of death reaching up from the ground. Thomas hit the field hard, rolling just like they'd taught him. He unclipped the chute and crawled to a ditch. The air was full of shouting, gunfire, and the distant thud of artillery. The invasion of Holland had begun. They called it Operation Market Garden, the biggest airborne assault in history. The plan was bold: seize the bridges across the Rhine before the Germans could destroy them, paving the way for Allied tanks to roll straight into Germany and end the war by Christmas. It was supposed to be over in a few days. It wasn't. By nightfall, Thomas's unit had reached the outskirts of Arnhem. The bridge, their bridge, stood tall in the distance, arching across the river like a promise. But between them and it lay streets full of Germans, machine guns, and rubble. They moved from house to house, kicking indoors, trading fire through shattered windows. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air. "Hold this street!" their lieutenant barked. Thomas set up behind a brick wall, Bren gun steady on the windowsill. His hands shook as he fed the magazine in. Every time he fired, the gun bucked against his shoulder, hot brass shells clinking at his feet. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang, steady and calm, as if mocking them. By the second day, they knew something was wrong. The radios barely worked, the reinforcements hadn't arrived, and the Germans, far from retreating, were closing in with tanks, big ones. From the window, Thomas saw the first Tiger tank roll down the street. Its gun looked like a giant's finger, pointing directly at them. "Back! Get back!" someone yelled. The shell hit the house next door, and the world exploded in dust and brick. Thomas stumbled into the cellar, ears ringing. A friend, little Jimmy Carter from Manchester, lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, not moving. "Jimmy?" Thomas whispered. No answer. He closed Jimmy's eyes with a trembling hand and sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of it all pressing down. By the third day, the food was gone. The ammo was running out. The wounded filled every corner of the basement. Yet somehow they kept fighting. They called it holding the bridge. For every man who fell, another took his place. When they ran out of bullets, they threw grenades. When they ran out of grenades, they waited with knives and courage. Thomas didn't remember how many times he pulled the trigger, or how many nights he stayed awake, listening to the tanks rumble closer. At dawn on the fourth day, a corporal crawled into the cellar and said quietly, "We're surrounded." Thomas nodded. He already knew. That evening he climbed up to the street level and peeked out. The city was burning. Smoke turned the sunset into blood-red light. Across the river he could see the bridge, still standing, still defended by a handful of men who refused to give up. They were cut off, but they wouldn't surrender. He watched them through the haze, little figures moving among wrecked lorries and burning cars, still firing. He felt something break inside him. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting because they couldn't do anything else. On the fifth night, the order finally came: withdraw. It felt like betrayal, but they obeyed. They crawled through the rain and mud, slipping past German patrols, whispering passwords in the dark. Some made it to the riverbank, others didn't. When Thomas finally reached the far side, he looked back one last time. The bridge was just a silhouette now, glowing faintly through the smoke. The bridge they had promised to hold, the bridge they had died for. He sat down on the muddy bank and wept. Months later, when the war ended, people called Arnhem a failure, but to Thomas it never felt that way. He'd seen what ordinary men could do, men who'd come from farms, shops and factories, standing shoulder to shoulder against tanks and artillery. They hadn't lost because they were weak. They'd lost because they were human. And in a strange way, that was what made it beautiful. Years later, Thomas returned to Arnhem as an old man. The bridge had been rebuilt. Tourists walked across it now, children eating ice cream, cars humming past. He leaned on his cane, watching the river flow beneath. The ghosts were still there. He could almost hear the crackle of the radios, the gunfire, the shouts. A young man passing by asked, "Were you there?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Aye," he said, "we were all there once." He looked up at the sky, clear and blue, no parachutes this time, and whispered a quiet prayer for the friends he'd left behind. The last bridge still stood, and so did the memory of those who never came home. April to 1943, somewhere in the cold grey heart of the North Atlantic, a wolf became the hunted. The sea was calm that morning, A dull silver sheet stretched in every direction, endless and silent. Beneath it, in the narrow steel belly of U-96, the air was thick with diesel and sweat. 18 men lived in that space no larger than a railway carriage, sleeping, eating, and breathing metal. Every sound mattered, every drop of air was precious. Seaman Klaus Ritter, barely 20, sat with his headphones pressed tight to his ears, listening for ghosts. His job was the radio, to catch faint Allied transmissions, to pick up orders from base, and, sometimes, to hear the slow, terrible ping of Allied sonar searching for them. He could tell what kind of ship hunted them just by the rhythm of that sound. Fast, tight pings meant destroyers, killers. Slow, distant ones meant safety. This morning it was silent. Captain Lehman stood by the periscope, pipe clamped between his teeth. He was calm, as always. A man carved from stone, with eyes that saw the ocean as a chessboard. "Surface for air," he said quietly. The chief engineer nodded. Valves hissed. The ballast tanks began to rise. Slowly, the U-boat pushed its snout toward the light. A rumble shook the hull as they broke the surface. The crew rushed to the conning tower. The fresh air was sharp and cold. The North Atlantic looked endless. Grey sky, grey water, and nothing else. Somewhere out there, Allied convoys crawled toward Britain, full of supplies. That was their prey. For months, the U-boats had ruled these waters. They called themselves the wolves of the sea. Ships burned in the night, convoys scattered, and sailors whispered about the terror that came from beneath. But that was before the Allies learned how to hunt back. That evening, they found their target. A convoy of merchant ships, 12 in a row, guarded by 2 destroyers. The captain smiled. "Ready torpedoes 1 and 2, he ordered. Klaus felt his heart hammer. The crew moved like clockwork, quiet, precise. Depth 8 meters, distance 1,000. "Fire 1!" The torpedoes slid out with a hiss. "Fire 2!" They waited. The seconds crawled. Then, boom! A dull, distant thud rolled through the water, the sound of death far away. Through the periscope, the captain saw smoke rise from one of the ships. "Hit," he said simply. The crew cheered, but softly, like men celebrating in a church. "Dive! 40 meters," the captain said. The celebration ended. Everyone went back to their stations. They all knew what came next. Retaliation. The sonar ping came 10 minutes later, once, twice, then faster. Klaus froze. The sound was steady, closing in. "Destroyer," he whispered. "Silent running," the captain ordered. Every light dimmed. Every man held his breath. The engines slowed to a whisper. Inside the steel tube, they became ghosts. Then came the first depth charge, a low, distant whoomp, followed by a shockwave that rattled every bolt in the hull. The lights flickered. A mug fell and shattered on the floor. Another explosion, closer. Water dripped from the ceiling. The sound of metal groaning filled the air. The radio man pressed his hands to his ears. The pings kept coming, faster, sharper, crueler. They were being painted by sonar, tracked like a heartbeat in the dark. Another explosion, closer still. The hull shuddered. Someone prayed under his breath. Hours passed like that, the destroyer circling above, the U-boat trapped below. "Depth 100, the engineer whispered. Lehman nodded. "Hold steady." But the pressure was rising. The metal popped and creaked like bones under strain. Klaus could feel it pressing on his chest, the weight of the ocean, crushing, suffocating. He thought of home, his mother's kitchen, the sound of her radio, the smell of bread. Another blast rocked the sub. The lights went out completely. Panic spread. Someone screamed. "Silence!" the captain hissed. His voice cut through the dark like a blade. The crew steadied. They waited. One more explosion, then nothing. The pings faded. The destroyer was gone. They surfaced after midnight. The ocean was calm again, indifferent. Klaus climbed to the deck, shaking. The stars were out. Thousands of them, clear and sharp. The sky looked like it had before the war, before all of it. He wondered how many men had died that night in the burning ship they'd hit. He wondered if they were thinking of home too. The captain lit his pipe and looked at the horizon. "The sea," he said quietly, "takes everyone in the end." Klaus didn't answer. A week later, they got orders to patrol farther west. The radio crackled with fragments of messages, distress calls from other U-boats, static and silence. The great wolf packs were dying one by one, radar, sonar, escort carriers. The Allies had turned the hunters into prey. Each new patrol felt like suicide. But they went because that's what they were trained to do. One night, during another depth charge attack, the captain was thrown across the control room. Blood on his forehead. The gauges shattered. The ballast tank cracked. They began to sink. "Blow ballast!" the chief shouted. No response. The levers jammed. The gauges spun. Water burst through a seam near the bow, spraying cold salt water across the floor. Men screamed, grabbing for tools, rags, anything. "Pump! Pump! Damn it!" But the pumps couldn't keep up. The ocean was coming in. The U-boat tilted nose down. The lights flickered again. Klaus looked at the depth gauge. 70, 80, 90 meters. The captain sat back in his chair, eyes closed. "It's over," he said quietly. Klaus thought he meant the boat, but later he realized he meant the war. When they finally stopped sinking, the silence was unbearable. Klaus closed his eyes and listened. To the creak of metal, the drip of water, and the heartbeat of a dying ship. He thought about the men they'd killed, the ships they'd sunk, the lives lost on both sides. All of it for a war that was slipping away like sand through fingers. Somewhere above them, the ocean went on. Vast, cold, eternal. Weeks later, U-96 never reported back. No distress call, no signal, just gone. Maybe they sank. Maybe they drifted. The sea doesn't tell stories, it keeps them. Years after the war, fishermen off the coast of Ireland found a rusted piece of metal tangled in their nets, a section of hull, numbers still faintly visible. It read U-96, they called submarines iron coffins. And in the end, that's what they were, graves that moved through the deep, carrying ghosts who once thought themselves wolves. April 1945, Berlin burns. The heart of the Reich beats its last, and the Red Army marches through the smoke. The streets of Berlin were no longer streets. They were trenches made of rubble, lined with ghosts. Every building was broken, walls torn open like wounds, roofs gone, windows black with soot. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burning. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered, shaking the ground every few seconds like the heartbeat of some dying giant. Private Nikolai Petrov adjusted his helmet and stared down what used to be a boulevard. It looked endless. Chunks of concrete, twisted trams, fallen lampposts. He'd been fighting since Stalingrad. He'd seen hell in many forms, snow, starvation, and steel. But this was different. Berlin wasn't just a city. It was the symbol of everything they had bled for, the heart of the beast. And now they were here to crush it. The order came through the static of the field radio. Advance to Alexanderplatz. Clear resistance. Simple words. Deadly work. Nikolai moved forward with his squad. The air was alive with sound, the crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the shriek of Katyusha rockets. Every step felt heavier. A tank rumbled past them, a T-34, its sides blackened by smoke. The crew inside waved as it roared forward, gun blazing. It fired into a building where German snipers had been hiding. The explosion ripped through brick and glass. The Russians cheered, but the cheer was short. A Panzerfaust shot from a window hit the tank's side. Flames burst out instantly. The turret popped open. One man tried to climb out, screaming. The fire took him before he reached the hatch. No one said a word. They just kept moving. Berlin was full of strange echoes, voices from radios, prayers from basements, the rumble of collapsing walls. Nikolai saw civilians too, mostly women, children, and old men, their faces grey from ash. Some waved white cloths from doorways, others hid in cellars, clutching whatever food was left. One old man stood by the remains of his bakery, staring blankly at the ruins. His apron was still white beneath the soot. Nikolai wanted to stop, to tell him something, that it was over, that it was done, but he had no words left. The squad passed him by, silent. That night, they set up in what used to be a cinema. The screen was torn, the seats half-burned. Someone found an old poster, a smiling couple under a bright swastika flag. "Funny," muttered Sergei, the machine gunner. "They said they'd last 1,000 years." Nikolai didn't laugh. He just sat, cleaning his rifle, in the flicker of a small fire. Outside, artillery thundered without pause. The Red Army was closing in from all sides. The Germans were fighting like cornered wolves. Old men with rifles, teenagers in Hitler Youth uniforms, even women with pistols. And yet, everyone knew it was hopeless. At dawn they moved again, toward the Reichstag. That name had been whispered like a myth for years, the place where it all began, the place where it would end. The closer they got, the thicker the fighting became. Machine gun fire raked the streets, mortar shells exploded on rooftops. Nikolai's squad crawled through an alley, bricks shattered around them, dust filled his lungs. They reached a courtyard littered with broken statues. German soldiers fired from the windows above. "Up there!" Sergei shouted, swinging his machine gun around. The sound of his weapon filled the air. Short, brutal bursts. The Germans fell silent. Then came a scream from their left. One of their men, Yuri, had been hit. Shrapnel through his chest. He gasped once and didn't move again. No one had time to mourn. By the third day, they reached the steps of the Reichstag. It was blackened by fire, the columns cracked, the roof half gone. The red flag waited in someone's pack, folded and ready. Inside, the halls were filled with debris, piles of stone, shattered marble, bits of banners. The echo of gunfire bounced through every corridor. German soldiers fought room by room. Some refused to surrender, others begged for mercy. Nikolai fired until his rifle clicked empty. He reloaded without thinking. His hands were shaking but steady. He saw a young German, maybe 17, crawling behind a pillar. The boy dropped his gun and raised his hands. His eyes were wide, terrified. For a moment, Nikolai saw himself. 10 years younger, scared, desperate to live. He lowered his rifle and motioned for the boy to run. The boy hesitated, then fled. Sergei saw it and said nothing. He just nodded once. Finally, the shooting stopped. Smoke drifted through the great hall. Sunlight filtered in through holes in the roof. Someone shouted, "Flag! The flag!" A soldier climbed up the shattered staircase, the red banner clutched tight. Slowly, carefully, he made his way to the roof. Nikolai followed him up. The air smelled of stone and fire. The wind was cold. When the soldier raised the flag over the dome, the world seemed to hold its breath. Below, in the ruined streets, thousands of men cheered. Tanks fired their guns in salute. The echo rolled across the city, across the ruins of an empire. Berlin had fallen. That night, Nikolai sat alone on the steps, watching the firelight dance against the broken buildings. The war wasn't over yet, but he knew it was close. He thought of all the faces he'd seen since Stalingrad, the comrades buried in snow, the civilians hiding in cellars, the enemies who looked just as tired and human as he felt now. He wondered what peace would look like. For so long, everything had been war. In the morning, he saw the same old man from before, the baker. He was walking down the street with a loaf of bread in his hands. Somehow, he had found flour. Somehow, he had made bread again. Nikolai watched him, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Because maybe, he thought, that's what victory really was. Not banners or speeches, but the small, stubborn act of living. Okinawa, 1945. The final storm. The last island before Japan. Every message from here feels like a whisper from the edge of the world. The static never stopped. Even when the guns fell silent for a moment, the radio in Corporal James' Dalton’s tent still crackled, a ghostly hiss that filled the air like breathing. He sat hunched over the set, headphones pressed tight, a cigarette burning between his fingers. His hands were always shaking, part nerves, part exhaustion, part too much black coffee. He'd been on this island for 70 days. Okinawa, the last step before Japan itself. He'd seen rain that came sideways, mud that swallowed boots whole, and shells that fell so close they lifted him off the ground. But the thing he remembered most was the sound, not the explosions but the voices, voices of pilots calling for help, voices of medics calling for stretchers, voices that faded into static and never came back. That was Jimmy's war, a war of wires, switches, and ghosts. The sun was setting over the cliffs when the next message came in. He was half asleep when he heard it, faint at first, buried in noise, then clearer. Mayday, Mayday. This is Bulldog 2. We've lost an engine, taking fire. Jimmy straightened up, twisting the knobs on the radio. The signal flickered in and out, the voice heavy with panic. We're hit. Fuel leaking, going down off the southern coast. Then silence. He stared at the dials, willing the voice to come back. Nothing. He wrote the coordinates on a scrap of paper and ran outside. "Lieutenant, we've got a bird down." Within minutes, search planes were scrambling, but deep down, Jimmy knew. By the time they found Bulldog 2, it would just be debris on the waves. That night, the rain came, hard and heavy, the kind that turned the ground into a swamp. Jimmy sat under a tarp, smoking, watching the flashes of artillery in the distance. The Marines were still fighting in the hills, Japanese defenders refusing to surrender, fighting to the last. Every explosion lit up the night like lightning. He turned to the young private beside him, a kid from Ohio named Tommy Reese, barely 19, freckles under the grime. "You ever think about what happens after?" Tommy asked, voice quiet. "After what?" "After the war, when we go home." Jimmy took a drag and stared into the dark. "Yeah," he said finally. "Every damn day." He thought of his mother's kitchen, the smell of coffee and bread. He thought of the radio at home, the one his dad used to listen to baseball games on. Back then, radio meant peace. Now it was just death in Morse code. 2 days later, the news came through the wire. Germany had surrendered. The men cheered. They clapped each other on the back. Someone even fired a flare into the sky. But the celebration died quickly, because for them the war wasn't over. Okinawa was still burning. Japan hadn't surrendered. The rumor was they'd fight to the very last island, the very last man. Jimmy watched the flare fade into smoke. "Europe's done," he muttered, "but we're still here." A week later, the airfield shook again. waves of kamikaze attacks, one after another. Jimmy ran to the shelter as sirens wailed. The sky was full of streaking lights, planes diving straight into ships offshore, explosions rolled across the horizon. The men watched in silence. There was no hate in their eyes anymore, just disbelief. So much destruction, so much death. And for what? When it was over, the radio was full of chaos. Rescue calls, status reports, fragments of human voices. Jimmy sat back at his desk, drenched in sweat, trying to keep up. Then came a message that made him pause. "This is Tokyo Rose. The Emperor thanks you for your bravery. Soon you will come home." Her voice, soft, almost gentle, drifted through the static. Tommy looked up from his cot. "Is that real?" Jimmy shook his head. "No idea, but I hope she's right." By July, Okinawa was silent. The battle was over. The island was nothing but ruins, mud, and memory. Jimmy still worked the radio, but the messages had changed. Now they were about supplies, transport, and homecoming. Until one morning, August 6th, when a new kind of message came in. Flash report: single bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Total destruction. Details to follow. The tent went quiet. No one spoke. They didn't understand it at first. A single bomb couldn't destroy a city. Then came the photos, then came the silence. 3 days later, another message. Second bomb dropped Nagasaki, Japan considering surrender. Jimmy just stared at the radio. After everything, the battles, the deaths, the storms, it ended not with a final charge, but with a whisper of light. On August 15th, 1945, the radio came alive one last time. To all Allied forces, he ceased hostilities. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. The war is over. Jimmy didn't move for a moment. He just sat there, the words echoing in his ears. Then he took off his headset and placed it gently on the desk. Outside, the men were cheering, shouting, crying. Tommy burst into the tent, laughing, tears in his eyes. "Jimmy, we're going home!" Jimmy smiled. Small, tired, but real. "Yeah," he said. "We are." He looked at the radio, the dials still glowing softly in the dark. The same machine that had carried so much fear, so much loss. Now it carried peace. He reached out and switched it off. The static faded. For the first time in years, there was silence. Weeks later, on the ship home, Jimmy stood on the deck as the ocean stretched endless and calm. He listened to the wind, the waves, the hum of the engines. And in that quiet, he thought of all the voices he'd heard, those who called for help, those who never got to go home. He whispered to them, a promise carried on the sea breeze. Message received.